Shay's Rebellion, Part 2. They lost the battle, but they won the war. The acts of civil disobedience staged by Captain Daniel Shay's followers and other local militias were disciplined in elaborate performances of political street theater. The veterans came wearing their army uniforms, some made of homespun flax, the cloth woven and dyed by their wives, harvested from their own fields. Flax was a crop introduced to the colonies by the Scots-Irish farmers. Only one out of four men even owned a musket. Others carried pikes, sticks, or pitchforks, but as they marched defiantly, in regimented files, accompanied by fifes and drums, they all kept their weapons on their shoulders, a clear signal that theirs was a demonstration of citizen dissent and not the posture of an attacking army. While it was no doubt true that a few tax collectors did get treated roughly as they were driven out of town, the restraint shown by the militiamen in these civil actions was reflective of their years of service under military discipline. Not a single courthouse was shut down by use of force, no property was damaged, not a shot was fired, not even a stone was thrown. Over the course of 3 short weeks, between late October and early November 1786, Governor Baudouin reconvened the legislature in a special session and directed them to issue a series of decrees, a suspension of habeas corpus, and two punitive acts to try and reel in the insurgents. The first was the Militia Act, which declared that any militiaman or sheriff or other officer of the law who killed a rioter refusing to lay down arms could not be held accountable for the death before the law, and that any militiaman who joined or abetted the rioters would be subject to execution. Next, he issued a riot act that declared that any armed men gathering in groups larger than 12 would be assumed insurrectionists. Any who would then refuse to lay down their arms upon being so ordered would be arrested, and the offenders would be tied at a public whipping post wherein they would receive 39 lashes upon the bare back. They would then be held in jail for no less than a year. All their property would be confiscated, and they would receive an additional 39 lashes every 3 months while incarcerated. The Riot Act was said to be the brainchild of State Representative Samuel Adams, who only 10 years previous had led insurrectionists in riots and boycotts and in taking up arms against the British tyrant. The famed patriot became a virulent persecutor of the regulators. He published statements in the newspaper declaring that rebellion against the king may be pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares to rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death. The government also offered a few conciliatory measures, such as lifting the demand that debt be paid in hard currency and providing some debt relief by selling off land in Maine, a territory still under the control of Massachusetts. But these measures were too little too late and paled in comparison to the punitive threats embedded in the new acts. Under the issuance of the draconian decrees, cooler heads in the legislature offered to pardon any regulators who would voluntarily turn themselves in and swear an oath of allegiance to the state. But by now the battle lines had been drawn. Only one man took up the offer. The yeoman farmers found themselves with backs up against the wall. They had joined in common cause calling for reasonable reform. Now many felt that their only recourse was to overthrow the government. The standing state militia, now numbering some 12,000, was under the command of Major General William Shepard. Many of the regulators had served under him in the 4th Regiment from Massachusetts. Governor Baudouin had authorized the legislature to increase the ranks of the militia, but the lawmakers refused, knowing that most of the constituents who had elected them were either sympathetic to the regulators or had joined their ranks. At the time, the federal government only had a standing army of 700 troops. Under the Articles of Confederation, these troops were only authorized to repel foreign invaders or suppress Indian uprisings. Secretary of War Henry Knox petitioned Congress for an additional 1,300 soldiers to put down the insurrection in Massachusetts. Congress agreed to muster the troops, but only under the pretense of there being trouble with the native population in the Ohio Valley. They feared they'd get no conscripts if the soldiers knew they were signing on to fight their own countrymen. The ruse didn't fool anybody, and they only managed to register 300 men from New Jersey. With the legislature once again out of session, General Baudouin sidestepped their authority and hatched a plan to pull together his own private army of 4,400 soldiers. He put in 250 pounds of his own funds as seed money and turned to the Boston merchants for donations. 150 of them stepped up with cash in hand. For 300 pounds, you could outfit 150 soldiers for a month, a sound investment to protect their interests. Baudouin requested 4,000 pounds and collected 10,000. When the rebellion was quashed, the investors received a return on their investment with interest paid in full by the state. The governor charged General Benjamin Lincoln with the job of recruiting and leading the mercenaries. Even with all the contributions, the general could only recruit 1,400 men for hire, all from the eastern townships. Once the troops were assembled, they set out to guard the armory in Springfield, which amounted to about a 5-day march over snowy roads. They requisitioned scarce provisions from the poor farmers along the way as they marched through the winter-starved countryside. The armory in Springfield was property of the federal government. All the weaponry of the Continental Army in New England was warehoused there. This included cannons and howitzers, sundry kegs of powder, and 7,000 new muskets. The armory had been established inland in the Connecticut River Valley to safeguard it from British coastal attacks. If the original intent of the regulators had been to overthrow the government, they had ample opportunity in the summer of 1786 to seize the armory before it was occupied by the militia of General Shepherd. That they did not choose to do so is evidence that their aim was civil disobedience to leverage reform, not to prosecute an armed rebellion. On hearing news that General Lincoln's well-armed mercenaries were on the move, the democratically elected leaders of the regulators assembled their respective militias and set their sights on the armory at Springfield. By the early winter of 1787, the captains had amassed 2,200 men in 3 divisions. The protest movement now morphed into an existential struggle. They reasoned that if they couldn't take the armory for themselves, they might very well be exterminated. Shays was at the head of one regiment on the east bank of the Connecticut River. Captain Luke Day's militia was encamped across the river in West Springfield, and Captain Eli Parsons, a former lieutenant in the Continental Army, was coming down from Chicopee to the north. Shepherd, with his 1,200 militiamen, already occupied the armory. The regulators' plan was to come at the armory in a pincher formation with 3 separate phalanxes on January 25th. One can only wonder what was going through the minds of the captains and their men as their protracted civil disobedience campaign teetered on the brink of armed revolt. For 5 months they had successfully shut down courts without any loss of life on either side of the dispute. Still wishing to avoid bloodshed, Days sent word to the other 2 captains that they should give Shepard another 24 hours to come to terms. As it happened, Days was related to Shepard by marriage. This history is fraught with numerous examples of these sorts of undercurrents, a tangle of nuanced familial and neighborly relationships and rivalries that have all the earmarks of a civil war. The fact that Captain Day was calling the shots on when to attack and was the one who sent terms to Shepard at the fort requesting that he stand down indicates that of the 3 captains, he was the lead officer in charge. Day was a decorated war hero, having fought from the siege of Boston to the surrender at Yorktown. Hailing from a prominent West Springfield family, he was well educated and well placed in society, and a person of moral and religious conviction. Shays, for his part, had already composed a letter to the legislature requesting an armistice and only asking for clemency until a special session could be convened to address their grievances. The message from Day to his compatriots was intercepted by Shepard's men. His militia would never reach Springfield. In an inexorable turning of the wheel of fate, Shays and Parsons marched on the armory according to plan. The weather on January 25th, 1787 was typical of New England, bitingly cold and with 4 feet of snow on the ground. Resolutely, the 2 columns of regulators marched forward. Shepard, who had illegally requisitioned arms and artillery from the federal stockpile, was waiting for them. Secretary of War Knox had attempted to get authorization for this action, but failed to assemble a quorum of the federal Congress. Shepard ordered his men to fire a volley of musket balls over the heads of the insurgents. When this failed to halt their progress, he ordered cannons loaded with grapeshot to be fired waist height into the oncoming marchers. To get an idea of the cruel lethality of grapeshot, think of buckshot the size of musket balls fired from a shotgun the size of a cannon. 3 men fell dead, and a fourth died later from his wounds, and 20 were injured. And with that, it was virtually all over. The regulators still hadn't fired a shot. They broke ranks and fled into the bitter countryside. After the regulators were defeated at the Springfield Armory, the legislature authorized the Disqualification Acts, which mandated that anyone who had participated in the uprisings would be barred for 3 years from voting or holding office or serving as jurors. They had to surrender their firearms, and they could not occupy certain employments, such as teaching school or operating an alehouse. The authorities offered this form of clemency to all those who were privates and not consigned officers in the rebellion, and those who would swear an oath of allegiance to the state. 4,000 did so, and when historians went through and did a complete survey of the rolls, they found that nearly half of the participants in the uprising were from the middle and upper classes. The poor farmers were not the only ones who felt disenfranchised and maltreated by the legislature dominated by Bostonian elites. Even Benjamin Lincoln publicly denounced the voting prohibition of the Disqualification Act as undemocratic. The rebels scattered and disappeared back into the countryside. Some headed north to the Republic of Vermont, where they were publicly disavowed but tacitly granted protection by Governor Thomas Chittenden, who had had the backing of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. The political refugees from Massachusetts encamped for a time on a property adjacent to Chittenden's farm in the town of Sandgate on the border with New York. Governor Baudouin requested extradition of the ringleaders, but the Vermonters claimed to be ignorant of the rebels' redoubt. The heads of state in Massachusetts were not too surprised by the denial and expressed opinions to the effect that Allen and his compatriots were a bunch of criminals running an outlaw regime. Daniel Shays fled first to New Hampshire and then to the regulator encampment in Sandgate. Although he was eventually pardoned by Hancock, he never returned to Massachusetts and is said to have died in obscurity and poverty in 1825 on a poor farm in upstate New York. General Lincoln relentlessly pursued the fleeing rebels and caught up with them in Petersham, where they had encamped in the midst of a howling blizzard. Lincoln's men attacked in the middle of the night, catching the regulators completely by surprise, and though no one was killed, the insurgent army was broken, and the 3 captains' militias were effectively disbanded. A small contingent of about 120 holdouts fled to New York to regroup. None of the captains was among them. These rebels made a daring foray back across the border in late February, raiding the homes and shops of the conservative opposition and taking 20 hostages. At this late hour in the insurgency, the remnants had devolved into a band of desperate outlaws on the run. By this time, most of Lincoln's militiamen had taken their month's pay and hightailed it back to the eastern townships. Brigadier John Ashley mustered a militia and put the final act of the rebellion down in a skirmish at the town of Sheffield. 1 soldier and 1 regulator died, but many more were severely wounded. Ashley claimed to have captured every regulator, but likely many got away and faded back into the countryside. It is said that history is written by the victors. In the case of Shays' rebellion, the state won the battle, but the farmers of western Massachusetts won the war. Although the rebellion was defeated, it did lead to direct and immediate reform to ease the economic distress of debtors. John Hancock was elected back into office of governor in 1788 with an overwhelming majority at 75% of the vote, and many seats were turned over in the legislature to representatives favorable to the yeoman farmers' cause, including no few won by the former regulators, even though the regulator candidates were denied the vote at the time of election. Over the succeeding 5 years, the tax rate in the state was reduced by 90%. Only 8 men were ever convicted of crimes associated with the rebellion. Hancock granted full pardon to all the participants, except for 2 men that were hanged for looting. Afterwards, he commenced a reconciliation tour throughout the impacted counties. William Shepard went on to serve as a congressman representing the state of Massachusetts. His neighbors held such deep resentment toward him for the slaughter of their comrades at the armory in Springfield that in a case of horrific rural justice, they gouged out the eyes of his prized herd of horses. After resigning from Congress, Shepard retired to his farm, where he is said to have died penniless. For his participation in the rebellion, Luke Day was sentenced to death by hanging for treason. Governor Hancock granted him a pardon, but Day nonetheless suffered ostracism from the Society of Gentlemen, including being dismissed from the prestigious Society of Cincinnati, where he had previously hobnobbed with such luminaries as Washington, Jefferson, and Hamilton, as well as his nemesis, Henry Knox. Day's health faltered, and like Shepard, he failed in his agricultural endeavors, dying poor and forgotten with complications from an acute case of gout in 1801. Shays' rebellion occurred in the years in between the signing of a peace treaty with England in 1783 until 1789, when the new Constitution was ratified. During this critical period, the sovereign states were loosely held together, but not yet governed as a nation by a weak federal Congress operating under the Articles of Confederation. A rising tide of nationalists were convinced that the Articles were too weak to hold the states together and were anxious to see them replaced with an empowered federal government. Foremost among this contingent was Alexander Hamilton of New York, James Madison of Virginia, along with John Adams of Massachusetts. The agrarian uprising of the regulators served as a fuel for Hamilton and Madison's later arguments on behalf of the Federalists. They sought to diminish states' rights in favor of a strong central government and executive, which they held were necessary to maintain the Union. 12 delegates from 5 states, including Madison from Virginia and Hamilton from New York, first convened in 1786 in Annapolis, Maryland, to ostensibly look at reforming trade and regulating tariffs. Their mandate was simply to amend the Articles of Confederation to improve trade relations between the states. In a classic case of what author and social scientist Naomi Klein describes as the shock doctrine, this group of unelected power brokers called for the Philadelphia Convention and used the crisis in Massachusetts to forward their agenda of drafting a new constitution that would establish a strong federal with a powerful executive. The hapless federal Congress had no choice but to tag along and give their imprimatur to the extra-governmental process. The paranoia that overtook the aristocratic class in the wake of the rebellion in Massachusetts was enough to stir George Washington out of retirement. He roused himself out of the quiet repose of his Virginia plantation at Mount Vernon beside the placid banks of the Potomac to attend the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Once there, he acceded to becoming the first president of the United States. As early as 1785, Washington had begun receiving disturbing reports of simmering rebellion from his former Continental Army Chief of Arms, Henry Knox, who had become the Secretary of War for the Federal Congress, and later held that position as a member of Washington's cabinet. Knox was a nationalist and a member of the Boston elite. He sent purposefully deceitful and overblown accounts claiming that 15,000 unruly farmers, not only in Massachusetts, but also in New Hampshire and Rhode Island, were on the brink of rising up and overthrowing state governments. These men were drunken anarchists who simply refused to pay their honest debts. There was a class inference to his descriptions, as many of the poor farmers throughout the Appalachians, from the Green Mountains of Vermont through the Alleghanies of Pennsylvania to the Great Smokies of Georgia, were the rowdy mountain folk of Scots-Irish descent, with the next biggest group being the Germans. When the delegates from Virginia, led by James Madison, arrived on the floor of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in May of 1787, armed with the Virginia Plan in hand and accompanied by the political heavyweight George Washington, they were already well prepared to ensure that the rule of the majority, direct democracy, would be thwarted. They advanced a framework of buffers to ensure that the minority, the elite ruling class, could have mechanisms in place, such as the Electoral College, to maintain control over the electoral process. Madison understood that the population of the fledgling nation would continue to grow and that in a direct democracy, that power would only increase. Under governance of a direct democracy, it would only be a matter of time before that majority would demand an equitable redistribution of wealth. Therefore, the founding fathers looked toward the representational model of a republic in favor of a true democracy. However, they did settle on some innovative approaches to representational democracy. The three-way division designed to create checks and balances of power between the bicameral Congress, the executive, and the judiciary, instituted by the founders, functioned remarkably well over the first 200 years or so of the American experiment. Before the new Constitution could be formally ratified, it was agreed that each state be granted the opportunity to convene its own convention to debate ratification on a state-by-state basis. Massachusetts went first. The Western townships sent many former regulators as delegates to the convention held in Boston. They were naturally very skeptical of a strong federal, and particularly the power of taxation. In the end, what won enough of them over, ratification passed with just 19 votes out of a polity of 254 representatives in attendance, was the promise of the power to draft amendments guaranteeing citizens' rights. This pattern was then repeated in other states, with the Massachusetts provision for amendments setting a precedent as an indispensable norm within negotiations. This compromise on the part of the founders to make provision for amendments to the Constitution was crucial to establishing the civil liberties we so often take for granted today. Alexander Hamilton didn't seem to learn much from the uprising of the regulators in Massachusetts. Much to the delight of the bondholders in Massachusetts, the newly constituted federal government had assumed the burden of the war debt of all the states. Once Hamilton appointed to the cabinet office of Secretary of the Treasury under President Washington, faced the same protracted issue of how to pay down the debt. Now armed with the power of federal taxation, Hamilton instituted a regressive tax on whiskey production that touched off another agrarian revolt in the Allegheny Hill country of western Pennsylvania. This time it required the first executive of the United States, appointed to his first term by Congress, riding out in front of an army of 13,000 troops to quell the Whiskey Rebellion. The last 25 years have witnessed a steady erosion of the power of the Congress, beginning with the Bush-Cheney War on Terror, textbook case of the shock doctrine that used the attacks of 9/11 as justification to erode the sole power of Congress to declare war, sanctioned torture and unlawful detainment, and created a new counterterrorism Homeland Security Department with special powers to abrogate the civil liberties of U.S. citizens. Then on to the Obama administration, in which an executive, frustrated by a recalcitrant majority opposition, resorted to governing by executive order, and culminating now in the second Trump term, where the president has been granted immunity from prosecution by the Supreme Court, corrupted the power of the pardon, usurped the power of the purse by canceling programs and putting spending freezes on funds already approved through legislation, and defying the rulings of federal courts. Seeming unable and unwilling to craft cogent legislation, the president's party rules by executive order. As we have seen, the U.S. War of Independence was a top-down movement directed by and for a ruling coalition of elites dominating the 13 colonies. But just because a revolution starts at the top doesn't mean it has to end there. As a nation, we have experienced 250 years of struggle to achieve full enfranchisement and a more just and inclusive economy. The power of the people can be repressed, but never fully denied. The War of Independence touched off a revolution that leaked out beyond the constraints of the founders and has led to solidarity movements for liberation and social equity among African Americans, women, farmers and ranchers, indigenous people, migrant laborers, non-binary, trans and queer folks, the disabled and more. It's not easy to predict when the next wave of authentic populist revolt will rise up in America, but it is not a matter of if, but of when. In a letter addressed to James Madison in February of 1787, Thomas Jefferson expressed that he did not share his friend's great apprehension concerning the disturbances so recently unfolding in the state of Massachusetts. On the eve of the convening of the Constitutional Convention, he wrote of the zeitgeist behind Shays' rebellion in these terms: "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure."